Welcome to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brian Griffith, and here's what's going down this week in your backyard and across the world. Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un's historic summit in Singapore has concluded, which marks the beginning of a long overdue peace process, decades in the making. The media rather considers this to be a major defeat and a so-called propaganda win for the DPRK. What is actually going on? What has happened at the summit? And what are the stakes right now? To talk about this, we are joined now by Walter Smolarek. He is a Sputnik News analyst and producer of the show Loud and Clear, as well as an organizer with the Answer Coalition. Thanks, Walter, for coming on the show.
Happy to be here.
Sputnik was able to send Brian Becker, the host of your show, to the summit. Can you tell us a little bit about what it looked like on the ground there?
Yeah, it was very interesting to hear about what the scene was like. It contrasts very sharply from what Brian reported to the atmosphere in the U.S. media, which was one of, just complete chaos and panic and, oh, isn't this terrible? Donald Trump, is surrendering to this great threat, this great enemy, North Korea. But in Singapore, because the overwhelming majority of journalists came from the region, came from Asian countries who have, a much deeper appreciation for the historic nature of this, who are generally more familiar with a history of just brutal U.S. aggression against Korea and, of course, other countries in East Asia as well. The feeling was much more jubilant. I mean, I think people in Singapore itself recognize, the historic importance of this meeting and what was being accomplished, even though it wasn't, a complete plan. It wasn't a complete agreement. I mean, who could realistically think that would come out of less than a day's worth of meetings between two sides that have, never met each other at that high of a level in terms of, head of state to head of state. So I think in Singapore, people were happy. People all around the world are very happy about this. And especially the Korean people, I think, overwhelmingly want reunification. I mean, opinion poll after opinion poll shows that. And it's the historic demand of the Korean people, this long-standing, thousands of years old civilization that's been cruelly and artificially divided by the United States, by U.S. imperialism for the past 70 years.
And when we talk about the actual opinions of the Korean people, so well over 80% of South Koreans support the peace process currently underway, are very supportive of it. Yet the U.S. media continues to be what I believe to be concern trolling about, quote unquote, helping our ally being the South Korean government. It seems like no one or very few people either within the South Korean government or the South Korean populace actually are concerned about this. So why would the media be reporting it this way? What is this concern trolling really all about?
The U.S. corporate media has shown once again that they're just a mouthpiece for the imperialist establishment, for the Pentagon war makers, for the foreign policy establishment at the State Department, the people who are the architects or the strategists for U.S. empire. And they're very alarmed because Donald Trump is an incompetent manager of their empire. I think that's been what the media's big objection to Donald Trump has been all along, that, he puts his own personal interests as a political figure, as his own ego, his own reputation, sometimes his own businesses ahead of their collective concerns. And so out of this desire, I think this is Trump's motivation, this desire to burnish his legacy, to get this, signature foreign policy accomplishment that he can tout as part of his, maybe his reelection campaign. He's willing to accept some reasonable conditions from North Korea. In other words, there's this. I mean, they made this demand so much that there's an acronym for it, CVID. So all of the Pentagon generals, the media pundits, they're talking about complete, verifiable and irreversible denuclearization, meaning that the only way that these talks should go forward, the only way that this peace process can go forward, is if North Korea essentially unilaterally capitulates right away. Complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization means surrendering Korean sovereignty And that's something that the DPRK is just not going to do. I think they are open to a type of denuclearization. In other words, they would give up this powerful and important nuclear deterrent that they've built up after many, many years of efforts if the United States is willing to offer one, economic relief from the suffocating sanctions that have been imposed on the country for decades, and two, security guarantees. The United States just suspended the military exercise, which I think is great that the U.S. suspended those exercises, which simulate the destruction of North Korea. Bombers, nuclear-capable U.S. bombers, fly right up to the border of the DPRK during these exercises. There's also the mere presence of 30,000 U.S. troops in the South carrying on this colonial-style occupation. So if the United States is willing to give up some of that, willing to lessen the economic pressure, sure, the DPRK would be willing to denuclearize in one way or another. I think that's basically what they're saying. But these media outlets from CNN, MSNBC, I mean, honestly, the so-called liberals have been the worst. MSNBC, CNN are saying that, well, this is a grave threat to international security because the agreement, that relatively short, I think is just like a page and a half, agreement that came out of the Singapore summit doesn't have these words: complete, verifiable, irreversible.
This summit, this is not, of course, the be all end all. This is just simply a day's worth of talks and of meetings. So it seems like the DPRK has actually been willing to put a lot more on the table than people realize. One of the other common refrains that I keep hearing out of the media is that the DPRK can't be trusted to hold to their agreements. But it seems like a lot of the reality has been that the U.S. has instead asked for almost unilateral capitulation in almost every case, while they refuse to suspend these war games. So it's interesting to me that the war games have finally come up within the media because Trump called them provocative and expensive. So now the media is having to actually acknowledge that these war games featuring 30,000 troops every year, simulated decapitations of the North Korean leadership, simulated nuclear war with North Korea, are now having to finally be acknowledged that this has been going on since the Korean War. Can you talk a little bit about the character of those and what the U.S. presence has actually looked like in Korea since the 1950s?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, before we get into the history, I just want to go back to one of your earlier comments about the this myth, this completely ridiculous and insidious myth that it's North Korea who can't be trusted. We've tried to make deals with them before. They went back on them, and they're probably, in terms of deals made between the United States and Korea, they're probably referring to something that was agreed to in the 1990s called the General Framework Agreement during the Clinton administration, whereby the DPRK agreed to give up what was the beginnings of its nuclear program, to dismantle some of its reactors and research facilities, and in exchange the United States would provide economic relief and help develop energy infrastructure. And so it was the United States that broke that agreement. I mean, it was the George W. Bush administration that declared that North Korea was part of the axis of evil and backed out of that whole process started by the Clinton administration and, of course, the South Korean government of Kim Dae-jung. So the United States just pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. I mean, it shows very clearly that the United States is actually the party that's not to be trusted. After this long, torturous, years-long negotiation with Iran, another country that, like North Korea, has been aggressively targeted for many, many years by the United States, targeted for regime change and possible military action. The Trump administration just said, no thanks, we don't want to anymore, which is of course illegal. I mean, the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, is a legally binding multilateral treaty that was signed by all of the members of the UN Security Council plus Germany, in addition to Iran. So the idea that North Korea is the untrustworthy party in these negotiations, I think, is ridiculous. The United States, of course, was built on unbroken treaties with indigenous people, and so many times throughout its history, the United States has gone back on its word when it's made some kind of agree or guarantee with a country that it perceives as being should rightfully be under the U.S. sphere of influence. So to address the other point that you were just asking about, what is the history of U.S. intervention and what has been, the consequences of U.S. intervention in Korea, I think it's been absolutely devastating. The 1950 to 1953 Korean War is not paid attention to very much in U.S. society. In fact, sometimes you hear people call it the forgotten war, but in Korea, it's certainly not forgotten in China and many other parts of the world, because the Korean War was a genocide. Curtis LeMay was the head of the U.S. Air Force during that period, and he later went on to become this far-right segregationist when George Wallace, the infamous segregationist governor, ran for president. He said, based on his firsthand experience commanding the U.S. Air Force in this war, that 1/5 of the Korean population was wiped out. That every village, town, city was completely leveled by U.S. air power and by other military means. That's true. I mean, the United States did that. Millions of Koreans died. The division of the Korean Peninsula has been just completely terrible for Korean people. I mean, families were divided. This idea that there's a North and South Korea is kind of presented as normal, but it's not. It's this terrible imposition and historic crime, I think, that the Korean people have been forced to endure. The line of demarcation, the 38th parallel, was drawn by two U.S. military officers. I think they were junior military officers on like a National Geographic map. It was this completely colonial project. Another instance or another example of the colonial nature of the U.S. presence in South Korea is part of the treaty that establishes the legitimacy of the operations and presence of U.S. troops in the South. A stipulation of that treaty is that in the event of a war, the United States becomes the commander of the South Korean armed forces. In other words, the highest ranking American becomes the leader of the South Korean army if there were ever to be a situation where their army would be used in combat in the event of a war. So I think that the United States must leave immediately, should leave immediately. That's clearly the desire of the people. But, it's going to be, realistically, it's going to be a long road to get to a point where that can be accomplished.
Let's talk about what the possibilities for Korean reunification at this point might look like, or otherwise de-escalation, given that so many powers are currently, it seems, trying to sabotage any chance of there being peace in Korea. The fact that the major defense contractors are their stocks actually plummet whenever there's the chance of a Korean reunification or Korean peace. So yeah, realistically, what are we looking at from coming out of the summit and beyond that? What are the possibilities there?
The mainstream discussion is about what will the Trump administration do next? Will they have a meeting, and will he go to Pyongyang? Will he invite Kim to come to the United States? Maybe they'll meet in some third party. But I think that a principal thing to look at, well, we have to remember how this summit came about in the first place. And it wasn't just the initiative of Donald Trump. I think it was primarily the initiative of Kim Jong-un and secondarily, I think, some very courageous steps taken by the progressive president of South Korea, Moon Jae-in. In Kim Jong-un's New Year's address to the people of North Korea, he essentially extended an olive branch. This was a period of extreme tension. Just a couple months before that, Donald Trump went to the United Nations that at the rostrum of the UN said that he would completely destroy North Korea, threatening a genocide against the people of North Korea, a second genocide. And so it was a very bold move, I think, to try to avert a catastrophe. And so the South Korean government responded positively to the olive branch that was extended by Kim Jong-un. There were the developments around the Olympics that took place in the South, where there was in hockey, there's a joint Korean North-South team. The Korean athletes, North and South, marched together in the parade. There was this this, wonderful, moving moment that, you'll remember. There's that famous picture of Mike Pence sort of sitting down and scowling while everyone around him is, smiling and jumping to their feet and applauding. And then, in late April, there was the historic inter-Korean summit between Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un, which is actually referenced in the declaration coming out of the Singapore summit. So that's where I would look. Can there be some more advanced agreements reached between the North and the South in the fields of, say, economic cooperation? I mean, that's something that could really help cement and give momentum to this peace process if there are economic ties that begin to be built between North and South, and then the United States not wanting to be left out of the game seems compelled to come to the negotiating table.
Yeah, I think you're really hitting on something important there, which is that this is so much of an accomplishment by the two Korean states, by North and South Korea coming together to really force a progressive agenda on the United States, who rightly has been outmaneuvered. I think the fact that the U.S. in some ways has been, diplomatically brought in only after the two leaders of the two Korean states were able to really de-escalate things is actually absolutely a good thing. And yet it's being touted kind of as the end of the world. The fact that a lot of the media is saying that this is a propaganda win. They've said it's a propaganda win either for the DPRK or for Russia and China. Rachel Maddow pointing out that North Korea shares a border with Russia. The horror that two countries
are geographically next to each other.
Nobody cares who this is a quote unquote propaganda win for. That's not an important thing. This is a major diplomatic victory for the world. If it continues along, hopefully, the de-escalation path that we've seen a little bit, that the world benefits when countries are at peace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's for sure true. One positive, maybe this will be a positive side effect, is that the remilitarization of Japan, the extreme right wing government of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, historically the colonial master in large parts of East Asia, they're doing their best to remilitarize the country, which is, a great threat to the people of the region and the world. And this, boogeyman of the North Korean menace is one of the key ways that, he's able to justify this to the Japanese public. And, his goal is to repeal Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which renounces war. It's the pacifist clause of the Japanese Constitution that progressive people in that country hold very dear. So, yeah, I mean, there's going to be all sorts of, removes a source of tension between the United States and China, right? Which is certainly good for the world, for the prospects of peace for the peoples of the world. There's another interesting thing that I thought we could note, going back to our historical discussion. Why has the South been open to this? I think that's a big question. We're pointing out that this is primarily a victory for the Korean people, done at the initiative of the Korean people. But South Korea has historically been ruled by people who are, politically on the right wing of the spectrum, and loyal servants of the United States. Until the 1980s, the country was run with a couple very brief intervals of democracy by the military, by a military dictatorship. And by a military that has its roots in the Japanese colonial occupation that prevailed before the American colonial occupation. Moon Jae-in's personal political trajectory comes from the pro-democracy student movement in the 1980s, and then he later entered mainstream politics and became a successful politician. So we sort of see the confluence of a number of historical trends here that allows for such a positive outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to go ahead and wrap up. Anything else that you feel needs to be mentioned about the Singapore summit, or generally the trajectory of the Korean peace at the moment?
One important thing to know is that the Democratic Party is absolutely to the right of Donald Trump. It's an amazing accomplishment. They are to the right of Donald Trump when it comes to pretty much all international issues. and their reaction, their disgusting racist colonial reaction to the progress made in Singapore shows that, I think, better than perhaps anything else.
Yeah, I absolutely could not agree more, and I think that's important for us to keep saying is that the Democrats are now so far to the right of Trump, and you can see. I always like to, of course, point out that they would rather lose because they're going to continue to lose as long as they keep these kind of hawkish foreign policy positions, but they'd rather lose while continuing to be on the right wing than even contemplate the possibility of progressive platforms. It seems like to me, their reaction to Korean peace has revealed that more than anything else. So yeah, we've been joined by Walter Smolarek. He's a Sputnik News analyst and producer of the show Loud and Clear, as well as an organizer with the Answer Coalition. That's Act Now to Stop War and End Racism Coalition. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
A new report by Amnesty International finds that the U.S., Britain, and France inflicted the worst destruction in decades in the Syrian city of Raqqa. The 4-month siege of Raqqa killed massive numbers of civilians and destroyed much of the city, where more artillery shells were launched than anywhere since the end of the Vietnam War, according to the report. At the same time, the Pentagon acknowledges it has no idea how many civilians it has killed during the 4-year campaign against ISIS and may never know the casualties. Joining us to talk about this issue is Dr. Greg Shupak, professor of media studies at the University of Guelph in Toronto, as well as author of the new book, The Wrong Story, Palestine, Israel, and the Media, which is out now. Thank you, Dr. Shupak, for coming back on the show.
Thanks again for having me.
So this was a pretty blatant, I believe, admission by the Pentagon to finally admit that they don't have any idea how many civilian casualties have been inflicted, considering they have so often vastly underestimated the number of casualties. It seems like a very, much more honest and honest admission of their recklessness within the Middle East, specifically Iraq and Syria, over the past couple decades.
I don't know that they're being entirely honest there, because Air Wars, airwars.org is a great resource for keeping track of people killed in the this U.S.-led war that is ostensibly aimed at ousting so-called ISIS. Air Wars has fairly detailed estimates and tallies of civilians killed in this war. And so they're able to come up with figures of several thousand, at least the most conservative estimates they put forth, in several thousand in each Iraq and Syria. So in that respect, I would say that the Pentagon may be trying to hide behind their claims of incompetence, when in reality they probably know roughly how evil they actually are.
Oh, yeah. I don't think there's any doubt that the Pentagon knows what it is they're doing, that they've displayed the same reckless disregard for human life as they always have. Yeah, I think you're right. I wonder if we're not seeing a shift now, because for so long, the Obama administration really ramped up so much of the drone warfare based on the presumption of precision, based on people believing that these drone strikes were precise. And the way they did that was really by reclassifying who was considered to be a military target, so that anyone who basically anyone who was quote unquote military age, meaning a young person who happened to be struck by a drone strike, was then assumed to be a militant, a combatant. And now it seems like they've just evolved in order to avoid the reality that most people, I think, at this point realize is that where the U.S. has been increasingly reckless. I also want to point out, though, that none of these U.S. strikes within Syria, to my knowledge, are actually legal. No one has invited the U.S. in to fight the so-called Islamic State. In fact, most of the actual defeat of the Islamic State has been done largely by the coalition of the Syrian Arab Army with assistance from Iran and Russia. So beyond the fact that these massive civilian casualties were inflicted, the very fact that the U.S. Is even in this area in the first place constitutes an ongoing war crime.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's perfectly legitimate for local forces based in the region to want to defeat ISIS. ISIS is, a brutal racist organization. However, as you correctly pointed out, in Syria, there is no legal justification whatsoever for the U.S. and its partners, UK and France, and previously Canada also, to be bombing Syria. They're not invited in by the host country. Hence, it contravenes international law. It also would seem to contravene American domestic law, if that matters as well. So, in that respect, it's kind of doubly illegal. I think it's, you're talking about the expansion of the definition of what constitutes a combatant in the supposed war on terror era. I think that's a very important point, but I would also add that the other expansion is the expansion of the battlefield to effectively the entire world. So, in the conception of the United States, it's legitimate to undertake killing essentially whomever they want, wherever they want, whenever they want. This is a substantial departure from conventional forms of warfare. It has no basis in international law, and in that regard, it really provides a kind of ready-made set of justifications anytime the United States wants to kill anybody, anywhere, for any reason.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's now turn to what's actually in this Amnesty International report. We, of course, are learning the civilian casualty here within Syria in particular among the U.S.'s many other military adventures across the world. The civilian casualty here in Raqqa was probably in the thousands or so, given the Amnesty International report. What else of interest might people take away from this, and what might Amnesty International's own angle? Because my understanding is they tend to be they tend to usually toe what's pretty close to a U.S. State Department line. So what might their angle be for putting this forward?
It's not totally unheard of for them to issue reports critical of the United States, but as with their material when they report on Israel as well, it's much more tempered than, say, criticisms that the organization Amnesty International puts forth about countries that are not allied with the United States. So, I mean, I think that what's lacking in the report, it's very useful as far as documenting the particulars of U.S. atrocities in Syria. But, I mean, it's worth pointing out even in a perfunctory way, and as far as I can tell, this is not in the report, but it's worth pointing out that this war that's being undertaken in the name of driving out ISIS, this is part of a longer term trajectory of U.S. policy in the region. So, I mean, it's worth noting that ISIS did not just kind of emerge outside of any context. It emerged in U.S. occupation jails in Iraq. It emerged in the context of U.S. arming of opposition fighters in Syria. So in November, the UK-based group Conflict Armament Research found that an extremely large portion of the weapons that ISIS has used came from or can be traced back to American pouring of weapons into the country, into Syria. So, in that regard, U.S. regime change policy in Syria is one of the major factors, or has been one of the major factors in giving ISIS strength in the first place. So, in my estimation, the fact that U.S. policy in Iraq and Syria is one of the major reasons that ISIS came into existence, makes the fact that America then goes and destroys cities like Raqqa, Syria, or Mosul, Iraq, in order to supposedly drive out ISIS, all the more egregious.
It also, I am always kind of curious as to how much of any given armament of whether it be kind of a dictatorship such as the Saudis or whether it be a force such as ISIS, how much of it is intentional versus how much of it is sort of a consequence of various forms of blowback? Because obviously the U.S. has used both the specter of this particular form of radical Islamic terrorism by arming, for instance, going back to even the Mujahideen, and at the same time has also propped up dictatorships such as the Saudis, often for the same purpose, for its control of particular regions, for its control over large swaths of land, uses both kind of the order and the chaos in many ways. And then, of course, it is able to sort of play off of its own chaos that it sows, such as we saw where the U.S. arms the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, going back to the 1980s to defeat the communists, to defeat the Soviets. Then the Mujahideen, of course, became the Taliban. Al Qaeda then became a force, and then that was the blowback that happened because of that. September 11th was then used to elevate the war on terrorism, which of course was largely not so much a war on terrorism as it was a regime change strategy. I want people to kind of realize that the war on terrorism was simply a pretense by the neoconservative project, by the Bush administration. They had plans to overthrow not just Iraq, but Libya, Syria, and Iran, and several other countries. For instance, North Korea were also on their radar for regime change. It seems like that point, though, they got bogged down more than they expected within Iraq, and now it seems like the U.S. Regime change operation in that area has largely, in many ways, stalled out. I always kind of wonder how much of with something like the Islamic State, how much of it is intentional versus how much of it is blowback. And I guess it may not be the best way to frame it, but that's kind of something that I always kind of think about.
Yeah, what you say about Afghanistan and is certainly true, and I think it makes the point rather clear that the U.S. ruling class does not, in principle, object to religious fundamentalism. It has a long history of supporting right-wing religious fundamentalists in the Middle East, nor does it in principle care about terrorism by any stretch. What the U.S. ruling class cares about is basically getting rid of forces that stand in its way politically. So in that respect, it was highly useful to have religious fundamentalists bleed the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, weaken the communist government in Afghanistan, just as even after the 9/11 horrors, it was still considered a reasonable decision or a worthwhile move by the U.S. ruling class to ally with forces that largely contained religious fundamentalists. The religiosity, I don't think, is necessarily the key factor here. We should be looking at them primarily in terms of what their relation is vis-a-vis imperialism and capitalism.
Yeah, I just wanted to say it's more of a, so many people focus on that religious element, and because there's so much Islamophobia in the country, that's one thing I always want to point out is that in this case, the particularly sectarian form of religion is weaponized, but doesn't represent really religious basis for this. It's more of a political faction, a kind of force in many ways similar to fascism.
Yeah, these are right-wing movements that the U.S. is allied with that happen to have a kind of religious element to them in Libya or in Syria, to give two recent post-9/11 examples where the U.S. saw it as worthwhile or useful to ally with
what they would call, Islamic fundamentalists or jihadists or whatever kind of dubious Orientalist language they use. But it's the same as, allying with, right-wing neo-Nazis in Ukraine or right-wing forces in Latin America. So, the fact that those in Ukraine and Latin America are Christians of various types is not the point. The point is that the alliances are based on what can advance the interests of U.S. capital and be used to secure U.S. hegemony around the globe. So, the whole framing of this in terms of religiosity, I think, is misguided, and it's worth pushing back against that. I think it's also worth noting too that, as much as Iraq was a neocon, the invasion of Iraq was the 2003 invasion was a sort of neocon project. It's worth noting that the overthrow of Libya, the Libyan government, and the efforts to overthrow or at least severely weaken the Syrian government were both undertaken by the Obama administration, so by the liberal hawks as well. So, this isn't just a partisan issue, but part of the bipartisan consensus of U.S. foreign policy, which is guided by the principle that U.S. primacy must be secured around the globe. And that's something that we can see as being consistent across Republican and Democratic administrations. As much as there are, differences in strategy and shifts according to time and so on and so forth, we see some of these core principles, the idea that it's necessary for the U.S. to control as much of the globe as possible and oust as many opponents of that control as possible. There's continuity in that, regardless of whether it's Obama in power or Bush or Trump or, go on down the list through Democratic and Republican presidents over the decades. Could be JFK, could be Nixon. Both are at war in Vietnam, for example.
We've seen at this point bombing of Iraq for every presidency since the first Gulf War. I think the last president not to have bombed Iraq would have been Ronald Reagan, correct?
Yeah. And I mean, at that time, Iraq, of course, which, like you cited with regard to the Taliban and the other analogous forces in Afghanistan, Iraq was in the Reagan era was an important cog in the U.S. empire. It was used to try to decimate Iran by colluding with Saddam Hussein's government to invade Iran and attack it using chemical warfare in a brutal war.
I also want people to understand the reason for this. I think it's important to always talk about the economics behind this. What leads a country to be a U.S. ally versus a U.S. enemy. People don't often hear about this. This is not a thing that's discussed as much, but it's always about the penetration of capital into any given land. A common conception during the Democratic fake resistance to George Bush during the Bush era, during the beginning of the War on Terror, was simply that Iraq was not a success because it didn't accomplish the goals, because it brought about the rise of, quote unquote, more terrorism, which really was resistance to the U.S. Regime change. But in many ways, for the real purpose, which was to destroy a competing state, to destroy a state that had was essentially building itself without the influence of, without the complete penetration of U.S. capital. In many ways, the goal in that regard was a success, the same way the NATO bombing campaign of Yugoslavia was a success, in that it simply, by the sheer destruction, was able to pave the way for privatization of the country's resources, and was simply able to literally destroy a competitor. The U.S. targeted so much of the civilian economy and infrastructure in Yugoslavia, and I wonder to what degree that's also true. It's true to some degree of Iraq. I wondered to what degree that's also true of Syria, where the U.S. goal in Syria if they cannot take down Bashar al-Assad, I wonder if their goal is not simply to leave the entire economy, to leave the entire people broken, to
yeah, absolutely. I think that's all really well put, and I totally agree about the misguided way in which success versus failure in these U.S. undertakings is often discussed. So, I mean, we can also point out that there's a matter of whether a maximum goal is achieved or a partial goal is achieved. So, yeah, I mean, they didn't presumably want Iraq to end up allied to a large degree with Iran, but they did make an enormous amount of money for weapons companies and reconstruction companies in invading the country, and as you say, just simply inflicted an enormous amount of pain on a rival. And the same is true in other cases. So in the case of Syria, yeah, I mean, they thus far have not, and it looks like they will not, succeeded in overthrowing the Syrian government entirely, but they have achieved really significant goals of weakening Syria dramatically and inflicting in the process enormous pain on the population. I would say not by accident by any means, but knowingly and on purpose, through sanctions, through flooding the country with weapons. When you give people weapons, they have a strange tendency to use those weapons. And so this is part of why the whole notion of blowback is misguided. They're knowingly giving weapons to some characters that are carrying out massacres against minority groups in Syria, for example. So, I mean, the somewhat well-known DIA report from 2012 makes very clear that at that point the U.S. knew that it was empowering some very right-wing racist sectarian organizations in Syria, and it proceeded to then ramp up its arming of those forces. It didn't stop. The New York Times reported in 2012 that these types of organizations were the ones benefiting from the U.S. role in helping weapons get into the country. And again, the U.S. reaction was not to stop. It was to increase the amount of weapons it was sending into the country. And, I could go on with other types of similar examples. So blowback, to return to our previous point, is misguided. And this ties into your question because, what's happening there is that, yeah, they might not be able to fully overthrow the Syrian government, but they've bled Iran in Syria, they've bled Hezbollah in Syria, they've bled the Syrian army, they've bled Russia. So they've inflicted a lot of pain on not only ordinary Syrian people, but on states and or a non-state group in the case of Hezbollah that are barriers to U.S. domination. The Syrian government was a key part of the pipeline of weaponry to Hezbollah, which was a very effective resistance organization, or is a very effective resistance organization for mounting a challenge to U.S. Prerogatives in the region, U.S.-Israeli prerogatives in the region, the two being more or less inseparable. So, they may not, the U.S. may not be able to effectively turn Syria into another Dubai, as they may have wished to do so, because frankly, Syria's allies have shown that they're, willing to really kind of go all in their defense of the Syrian government. So I think this calculation among U.S. planners is, well, we can't necessarily, short of, nuclear war with Russia, we can't achieve our maximum goal of completely transforming Syria into what we'd like. So we can at least subject it to a war that's going to take this once independent country and have it utterly leveled. And in that respect, make it much, much, much less capable of
carrying out any kind of opposition to U.S. prerogatives in the region. And in the process, the Syrian economy can be ruined, and a lot of pain can be inflicted on the rival powers, as I mentioned as well. So, the main goal of overthrowing the Syrian government, the ideal outcome as U.S. planners see it, has not been achieved and probably won't be, at least as it looks right now. But these kind of, acceptable secondary goals of bleeding the country and its allies has worked out pretty well for the U.S. thus far.
You mentioned like all of the strategies short of nuclear war with Russia. I think that's a bold claim to make, that current factions within the U.S. would actually stop short of nuclear war with Russia. It seems like that's now a non-zero possibility. And I think that the reason for that so much was that while the U.S. was bogged down in these unwinnable, again, we're talking about what actually constitutes a victory, but these partial victories within, that was bogged down in within Iraq and Syria, it was not able to complete the regime change operations there. And during that time, other forces were able to, specifically state actors were able to rise to global prominence in the absence of that specific U.S. militarism directed against them, because for a while there was no U.S. militarism directed at Russia or China. They were able to develop their economies. And I think that's why we're now seeing this real push toward, a non-zero possibility. There is now a possibility that there are forces within the U.S. who are contemplating a nuclear war with Russia. And I think that's it. I think the U.S. Essentially has been balancing these regime change operations for so long. They dropped a couple of these balls in they kind of dropped the ball on their plans with Russia, and they dropped the ball on their plans with China. They were not able to successfully overthrow those countries. And so now as the U.S. empire is no longer the sole dominating force, as we now have a multipolar world, it really seems like the U.S. is now, as we've seen, gearing up for what they call major power confrontations with one or the other of these countries, or possibly both.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're absolutely right that it's a non-zero possibility. I mean, in February, the U.S. carried out strikes in Syria, killing roughly 100 Russian citizens. I mean, that's really a major, major event that got very little media attention here. You can imagine if Russia carried out any act that killed roughly 100 American citizens, that itself might trigger World War III. So what I'm getting at here is that that's showing a real willingness to take extremely violent and dangerous actions against Russians, even as Russia is a nuclear power. So I mean, I fully agree that one should be prepared for the very, very serious risks of U.S.-Russia confrontation.
Yeah,
and China too, which is related, but somewhat also it has its own kind of dynamics. The U.S.-China rivalry, and I think that's part of what we're seeing play out in the case of North Korea.
And we're now seeing kind of the rumblings of a lot of often explicit racism or otherwise charges. I believe there was a major state official, I'm blanking on the name, but somebody essentially said that all Chinese students might potentially be spies, et cetera, et cetera. So we're probably seeing that Cold War ramp up again as random Chinese companies are now accused of espionage, et cetera, et cetera. I think for now we're going to have to leave it there. We've been talking with we've been talking with Dr. Greg Shupak, who's a professor of media studies at the University of Guelph in Toronto. You have a new book that just came out. I'd like to give you a chance to talk a little bit about that. It's The Wrong Story, Israel, Palestine, and the Media. Can you tell us a little bit about the how that book came to fruition, and what the main kind of theses of it are?
Okay, sure. Thanks. It's so the essential point of the book is to look at the stories that media outlets tell about the Palestine Israel issue. And so what I do is I look at what seem to me to be three dominant narratives surrounding Palestine coverage, and these narratives, I think, all are false, or at the very least, horribly misguided. So the first of these would be the notion that Palestine-Israel is a quote-unquote conflict in which both sides have suffered to comparable degrees and are equally or roughly equally responsible for the absence of a resolution. This, I think, is extremely misguided. I think it's much more accurate to describe it as a colonial issue, where one side is colonial power that has ethnically cleansed the other side and subjected them to occupation and second-class citizenship. The second major media narrative that I look at is the idea that the problem in Palestine and Israel is quote-unquote extremists. It's most often Palestinians who are described as extremists, particularly an outfit like Hamas. But occasionally the media will talk about some Israelis kind of on the far right of their political establishment, or some of the settlers, as being extremists who are, supposedly leading Israel from its otherwise virtuous path. So on the Palestinian angle, the media coverage will say, well, these Palestinian extremists, namely Hamas, are ruining it, and America must America and the West need to support the Palestinian Authority. So I aim to show in this chapter that, well, really what's going on here is not a problem of extremists and moderates, but a problem of Israeli settler colonialism back to the hilt by U.S. imperialism. When they call for empowering the Palestinian Authority in the media, what they're really calling for is empowering effectively a U.S.-Israeli ally, in effect, right? The Palestinian Authority acts as basically an agent for America and Israel, at least to a very large degree it does. So the third major narrative that I look at, third and final one, is the idea that it's useful to understand violence that happens in Palestine in terms of Israel's so-called right to defend itself. So I essentially make the argument here that, one, this overlooks the Palestinians' right to liberate themselves. This is protected by international law. What we're talking about here is the fact that colonized people subjected to apartheid, have a right to emancipate themselves that extends to the right to armed struggle. That's completely obliterated from the public consciousness in at least in terms of what Western media attempts to do. So I talk about that. I talk about how it's a fallacy to talk about Israeli self-defense when the entire Israeli project is premised upon violent dispossession and oppression of Palestinians. So Palestinians have not colonized Israel militarily and through ethnic cleansing. Israel has done the opposite. So I essentially am making the case here that if anyone has a self-defense right that we should be talking about, it's the Palestinian right to self-defense. To take Gaza as a really easy example, anytime there's any kind of use of force by Palestinians, whether that's a so-called arson kite or a Hamas rocket, the idea is that, okay, Palestinians fire rockets, Israel fires back, or something like that. One that often overlooks the fact that often enough these rockets are a response to some act of Israeli aggression. But what's completely removed from the context is the fact that Gaza is subjected to a brutal military siege. Well, subjecting people to a brutal military siege is violence. As long as there's a siege in place, then it's a logical impossibility to talk about Palestinians initiating violence, and hence it's a logical impossibility to talk about Israeli self-defense. One could probably extend that beyond just the siege of Gaza to the entire goal of maintaining an ethno-state across historic Palestine. So that's what I attempt to show in the book, the ways that the media, which is obviously a key factor in shaping how people understand these issues, really disorients the population on this matter. And that's really important, considering that Israel would not be able to do what it does on anything close to the scale that it has done and continues to do without its support from the West, and crucially, decisively, its support from America.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, we will all pray for the many victims of the so-called Hamas attack kites that the IDF, the so-called Israeli Defense Forces, but actually the Israeli Assault Forces, tweeted about the Hamas attack kites. More than anything else, that tweet shows the disparity there between the reality of Israeli settler colonialism and the mythology of Israel as a supposed embattled, under siege, quote unquote democracy, when the biggest threat they can find, the biggest thing they can accuse the Palestinians of is flying Hamas attack kites. Can you tell people where, if they are interested in the book, where can they find more information?
If you're interested in the book, you can visit the website of OR Books. That's OR Books. And we have an excerpt from the book there. And so you can have a look at the first chapter. And you can order the book if you choose to do so.
All right. We have been talking with Dr. Craig Shupak. He is professor of media studies at the University of Guelph in Toronto, as well as the author of The Wrong Story, Israel, Palestine, and the Media. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks again for having me.
That's all we have for this week. You've been listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. You can find our show on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Stitcher by typing in People's Republic. Or you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. Thank you for listening as we report on the global struggle for social and economic justice. We are out of here.